The Ohio landscape whipped past my window in a blur of gray and brown. The last 100 miles of I-70 East heading into Columbus are always the hardest. It's not the traffic, it's the weight of expectation. Every exit sign felt like a countdown to a performance I never auditioned for. The annual role of the prodigal son, the family's resident disappointment. 5 years. 5 years since I'd packed my life into a used sedan and driven south to Austin, leaving behind the stifling legacy of Miller & Sons Construction and the even more stifling expectations of my father, Richard Miller. I could still feel the heat of our last argument, the one that broke everything. It happened in his dusty, wood-paneled office, a room that smelled of sawdust and stale coffee. I had come to him with a meticulously prepared presentation, market analysis, financial projections, a whole new business model. I showed him how the industry was changing, how tech-driven efficiency and sustainable materials weren't just trends, but the future. I told him we could be a leader, not just a local name clinging to the past. He didn't even look at my documents. He'd slammed his hand on his massive oak desk, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. "This isn't some tech startup, Alex," he'd boomed, his voice echoing off the framed photos of my grandfather and him on various construction sites. "This is my father's legacy. It's my legacy. You don't respect that. You just want to tear it all down." He saw disrespect. I saw survival. I saw a proud, stubborn man captaining a ship straight toward an iceberg, and he accused me of trying to mutiny. So I left. I went to Austin and built a career from nothing, first in tech consulting, then in private equity. We barely spoke. A stilted phone call on Christmas, a generic birthday card. My communication with my siblings, Mark and Chloe, devolved into a group text chat that I was mostly silent in. Pulling onto the familiar tree-lined street of the suburb I grew up in, my stomach twisted. The house stood exactly as it always had, a sprawling 2-story brick colonial, the picture of upper-middle-class success. The lawn was impeccably manicured, the hedges perfectly squared. It was a fortress of tradition, Richard Miller's kingdom. As I parked my rental car behind my brother's shiny new black SUV, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. The front door opened before I could even ring the bell. My mother stood there, a forced, tight smile on her face. She wiped her hands on her apron, the familiar scent of roasting turkey and sage stuffing wafting out into the crisp November air. "Alex, you made it!" She hugged me briefly, a little too quickly. It was a hug that was more for show, in case the neighbors were watching. Over her shoulder, I saw my brother Mark leaning against the archway to the living room. He had the same stocky build as our father, but wore it with an air of unearned smugness. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he said, a grin playing on his lips. "Decided to grace us with your presence, Mr. Big Shot." He strode forward and gave me a one-armed, back-patting hug that felt more like a dominance display. My sister, Chloe, was curled up on the armchair, her face illuminated by the blue light of her phone. She glanced up for a fraction of a second. "Hey, Alex." Then her eyes were back on the screen, her thumb scrolling furiously. So much for a warm welcome. The air in the house was thick, heavy with years of unspoken resentment. It was like walking into a museum of our family's fractured past. The pre-dinner small talk was an exercise in tension. I sat on the edge of the stiff, rarely used sofa while my father held court from his favorite leather recliner. He'd barely grunted a "Hello, Alexander" when I walked in, but now he was on a roll, boasting about the business. "Just landed a big custom home build out in New Albany," he announced to the room, though his eyes kept flicking to me, gauging my reaction. "Real quality work. Built to last, not like these new cookie-cutter houses that'll fall apart in a decade." Mark nodded along like a bobblehead. "Dad's got the best reputation in the state, always has." But I could hear what wasn't being said. I caught the subtle clues he was trying so hard to cover up. He didn't mention the massive downtown redevelopment project, a city contract Miller & Sons should have won easily. I'd read in an industry journal they'd been underbid by a competitor I'd been tracking, Apex Development. Then came the offhand complaints, disguised as the grumblings of a seasoned veteran. "Price of lumber is just ridiculous, for crying out loud." Hard to give an honest quote when the numbers change every week, he'd say with a shake of his head. Translation? His margins were getting squeezed to nothing. And this apex development, vultures, he spat, the name dripping with contempt. They're throwing out ridiculously low bids all over town. They're driving good, honest builders out of business with their shoddy work. It's a race to the bottom, and I won't participate in it. I just sat there, nodding politely, sipping a glass of water. In my world in Austin, a company like Apex wasn't just a competitor, they were a predator. They didn't just win bids. They targeted over-leveraged old guard companies, drove them to the brink, and then bought their assets for pennies on the dollar. My father saw a nuisance. I saw a shark circling. He was blind to the blood in the water, his own. Every word he spoke confirmed the grim analysis I had been piecing together from afar for the last year. Miller & Sons wasn't just struggling, it was dying. And my family, blissfully or willfully ignorant, was getting ready to sit down for a Thanksgiving feast on the deck of a sinking ship. The scent of roasted turkey and sage stuffing, which usually meant comfort and tradition, hung heavy and cloying in the air. It was a suffocating blanket woven with years of unspoken resentment. We sat around the polished mahogany table, a perfect portrait of a prosperous American family for a Rockwell painting, if Rockwell had ever decided to paint a battlefield disguised as a dining room. Every clink of a fork against my mother's heirloom china sounded like a gunshot in the thick, syrupy silence that pooled between the forced pleasantries. My mother, a ghost at her own feast, kept her eyes glued to her plate, meticulously cutting her turkey into impossibly small pieces. Chloe, my sister, was scrolling through her phone beneath the table, a tiny, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips whenever she glanced up at me. My brother Mark sat directly across from me, his posture a study in barely contained arrogance. He'd spent the last hour making thinly veiled jabs about my life in Austin. "So, Alex," he'd said while passing the mashed potatoes, "still playing with funny money and computers? Out here in the real world, we build things, tangible things." He'd flexed his hand, calloused from years of gripping a steering wheel on site, a stark contrast to my own, which were calloused from a keyboard. I just nodded. "It pays the bills, Mark." Now, the main course was over, the plates mostly cleared, and the air was tightening. My father, Richard Miller, pushed his chair back with a scrape that made us all jump. He tapped his water glass with a spoon, a sound I'd heard preface every major and usually unpleasant family announcement of my life. He stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared, trying to project the same image of indomitable strength he'd had 20 years ago. But I could see the cracks, the faint tremor in his hand, the extra sag of skin under his jaw, the weariness in his eyes that no amount of pride could hide. "As you all know," he began, his voice booming with practiced authority, "I've poured my heart and my soul into Miller & Sons construction for over 40 years. I built it from nothing with my bare hands and a belief in hard work." He paused, his gaze sweeping over Mark and Chloe with paternal warmth before it landed on me, chilling by several degrees. "It's been my life's work, my legacy." Mark and Chloe nodded solemnly, their faces perfectly arranged into masks of filial piety. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This was it, the speech I'd been dreading. "But a man has to know when to secure his family's future," he continued, his voice lowering for dramatic effect. "The market is changing. It's a different world. So, after a lot of thought and some very successful negotiations, we are selling Miller & Sons." A theatrical gasp escaped Chloe's lips, her hand flying to her chest. Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed in a caricature of concern. But I saw it, the flicker of avarice in Chloe's eyes, the way Mark's knuckles went white as he gripped the table. Not in shock, but in anticipation. They were terrible actors. My father let the weight of his words settle. He then turned his full attention to me, his expression hardening into something cold and final. It felt like a judge passing a sentence. "Mark and Chloe," he declared, his voice ringing with self-righteousness, "have been loyal. They've been here, day in and day out, respecting the sweat and sacrifice that built this company. They will be well compensated for their loyalty." He looked from his favored son to his daughter, a proud smile spreading across his face. They will be taken care of for the rest of their lives. He turned back to me. The silence in the room became absolute. Even the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to have died. "Alex," he said, and my name was an indictment on his tongue. "Since you abandoned this family, since you turned your back on this business to chase your own selfish dreams, you get nothing." The words hit me, but not in the way he expected. It wasn't a bullet, it was a confirmation, the final piece of data I needed for a model I'd been building for years. But before I could even process, the unthinkable happened. Mark grinned, a wide, wolfish baring of teeth. He raised his sparkling cider in its fancy glass. "A toast," he boomed, his eyes locked on mine, dripping with malice. "To the future, and to loyalty." Chloe, her fake sadness evaporating in an instant, giggled and raised her own glass. "To the future," she echoed. The clink of their glasses striking each other was sharp, brittle, and impossibly cruel. It was the sound of my official excommunication. They weren't just accepting my disinheritance, they were celebrating it. They were dancing on the grave of my relationship with my family. My mother flinched, a small, pained sound escaping her lips, but she said nothing. She just stared at her plate, a casualty in a war she refused to fight. My father watched my siblings toast, his chest puffed out, a smug look of justification on his face. He had orchestrated this humiliation, and he was savoring it. They all turned to me then, expecting a reaction. An outburst, yelling, tears. They wanted me to shatter. I did none of those things. My expression remained neutral. I slowly, deliberately reached for my own glass of water. My hand was perfectly steady. I brought it to my lips and took a long, slow sip, my eyes never leaving my father's. My stillness was a wrench in their celebratory machine. I could see the confusion starting to bloom on their faces. The triumph in Mark's eyes flickered, replaced by a sliver of unease. This wasn't going according to their script. I placed the glass down on the coaster with a soft thud. The silence stretched. "Okay," I said, my voice quiet but clear, cutting through the tension. "Okay," my father sputtered, his face starting to redden. "That's all you have to say? I just told you that you're cut off, that your inheritance is gone, and you say, okay?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. "I have a few questions, if that's all right." Mark scoffed. "Questions? Like where you're going to get a handout now?" I ignored him, keeping my focus entirely on my father. "First question," I said, my tone becoming clinical, professional. "The $50 million. Did you get a formal, independent, third-party valuation of the company's assets, goodwill, and current project liabilities?" My father's jaw worked. We had people look at the books." "What people?" I pressed, my voice still level. "Who advised you on the deal structure? What firm? Did they specialize in construction industry mergers and acquisitions?" "That's none of your business," he snapped, his voice rising. "It was a private deal. You have no right to question me." "I see," I said, a little too calmly. "And are you absolutely certain that $50 million was the best possible offer? For a company with a 40-year legacy, it seems a little on the low side, considering the real estate holdings alone." "Low?" Mark burst out laughing, a harsh, ugly sound. "Are you crazy? It's a fortune. Just because you're not getting any, you have to tear it down?" "It's just sour grapes, Alex." "It's not sour grapes, Mark. It's due diligence," I replied, not even glancing at him. I looked back at my father, whose face was now a thunderous mask of rage and wounded pride. My quiet, precise questions were doing more damage than any screaming match ever could. I was dismantling his grand moment of triumph by exposing the flimsy foundation it was built on. I was showing him, in front of the children he'd chosen over me, that he was a fool who'd been taken for a ride. "I've had enough of this," he roared, slamming his fist on the table, making the silverware jump. "You come into my house, you insult my intelligence, you disrespect my decisions. It's done. The deal is done. The business is sold to a major investment firm, a real powerhouse." I held his furious gaze. I let him finish his tirade, let the echoes of his anger fade in the suddenly cavernous dining room. My heart was pounding, but on the outside I was a statue of calm. This was the moment, the culmination of 3 years of silent, grinding work. I just smiled, a small, sad, knowing smile. "Dad," I asked, my voice dropping back to that same quiet, disarming tone, "who's the buyer?" He looked momentarily thrown by the simplicity of the question, but his pride resurfaced immediately. He practically spat the name out, as if it were the ultimate proof of his success, the final blow to my perceived arrogance. He said proudly, "Everest Holdings, and they're paying a cool $50 million. I let out a short, soft laugh. It wasn't a laugh of mirth. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place, of a complicated plan reaching its inevitable conclusion. My father's face contorted in fury. "What's so funny?" I shook my head, the sad smile still on my face, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Dad," I said, and every ounce of noise and energy seemed to flee the room, sucked into the vacuum I was about to create. "I am Everest Holdings." The silence that followed was a physical thing. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the dense, airless vacuum that comes after a thunderclap. I could hear the grandfather clock in the entryway ticking, each tick a hammer blow against the stillness. The faint scent of cinnamon and cloves from the cooling pumpkin pie on the sideboard felt suddenly suffocating. My mother's hand was frozen halfway to her mouth, a forkful of sweet potato casserole suspended in mid-air. Chloe's perfectly manicured fingers were clutched around the stem of her water goblet, her knuckles white. Mark's face was a mask of sneering disbelief. And my father's proud, triumphant expression had curdled into something tight and unreadable. Then the silence broke, not with a bang, but with a short, barking laugh from my father. It was the laugh he'd always used on me when I was a kid with a scraped knee or a brilliant idea for a treehouse that defied the laws of physics. It was a laugh of pure condescension. "Don't be ridiculous, Alex," he scoffed, shaking his head as if warding off a pesky fly. "Everest Holdings is a major private equity firm. You think this is some kind of game? A joke to get back at me?" Mark chimed in, his voice dripping with venom. "He's delusional. He flies in from Austin thinking he's some kind of tech millionaire and expects us to believe he just bought Dad's company for $50 million bucks? You're a liar, Alex. You've always been a liar, always needing to be the center of attention." They looked at each other, a shared, smug smirk passing between father and older son. They were a team. They had always been a team. I didn't get angry. I didn't raise my voice. The hot-headed kid they remembered, the one who would have slammed his fists on the table and screamed about injustice, was long gone. I calmly took another slow sip of water, letting the cool liquid slide down my throat. My composure seemed to unnerve them more than any outburst could have. "It's not a joke, Dad," I said quietly. My voice was even, almost flat. I placed my iPhone face up on the polished mahogany table right next to the gravy boat. The screen glowed to life. And it's not just me playing pretend. With a few deliberate taps, I pulled up the first document. The screen was bright in the dimming dining room light. "These," I said, my voice cutting through their sputtering protests, "are the articles of incorporation for Everest Holdings, LLC, registered in the state of Delaware. You'll notice the date." I zoomed in. 3 years ago. This wasn't a last-minute decision. Richard squinted, leaning forward slightly. Mark just sneered. "Anyone can fake a document, you little weasel." I ignored him and swiped to the next file. A cascade of spreadsheets and charts filled the screen. "These are the financial models, the stress tests against market fluctuations, the projections for material cost increases, the competitive analysis of every firm in the tri-state area, including Apex Development." I let them look at the intricate web of numbers, the language my father had always called nerd nonsense. It was the language of the world he refused to understand, and it was the language that now owned him. Then I swiped one last time. There it was, the final, binding offer letter. The Everest Holdings letterhead was crisp and clear. The offer amount, $50 million, was highlighted. And at the bottom, on the signature line for the buyer, was a name written in clean, decisive digital ink. I tapped the screen, zooming in until the signature filled my phone. Alexander Miller, CEO. Reality crashed into the room like a wrecking ball. The first sound was a choked sob from Chloe. It wasn't a cry of familial betrayal or shock. It was the raw, panicked sound of a jackpot being snatched away. "Wait!" she wailed, her eyes wide and glossy with tears. "Does this mean the money? I'm not getting my money?" Before I could answer, chaos erupted. Mark exploded. With a guttural roar, he shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward onto the floor. "You snake!" he screamed, his face turning a blotchy red. He lunged across the corner of the table toward me, his hands clawed like talons. "You're trying to steal our money! You're stealing Dad's company!" He never reached me. My mother, finally snapping out of her stupor, shrieked my name and grabbed his arm. He thrashed, knocking a glass of cranberry juice over. The dark red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a wound. But my eyes were on my father. He hadn't moved. He was a statue carved from pure, mortified rage. The color had drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy gray pallor. His jaw was clenched, so tight I thought his teeth might crack. The proud patriarch, the king of Miller & Sons, had just been publicly overthrown by the son he had cast out. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken whisper, laced with a humiliation so profound it was almost tangible. You deceived your own father." I finally looked up from my phone, my calm exterior holding firm. I met his gaze directly. "Deceived? No. I just played by the rules of the world you're in, Dad. The world you taught me doesn't exist." Then I delivered the final blow. I tapped my phone again, opening one last password-protected folder. It was a dossier I'd compiled over months, a grim financial autopsy of the company he was so proud of. "You think this was about me wanting the company?" I asked, my voice turning hard. "Let me show you the company you were selling." I turned the phone so they could all see. Page after page of internal reports I'd acquired. Emails from panicked suppliers about unpaid invoices. Charts showing a terrifying downward trend. Miller & Sons Construction has been bleeding money for 18 months. Your refusal to modernize, to update your bidding software, to diversify. Mark's management has been driving it into the ground. Apex was just waiting in the wings. This company, your legacy, was about 6 months from total insolvency. 6 months from having to file for bankruptcy. I let that sink in. The only sound was Chloe's quiet, gulping sobs. Everest Holdings' $50 million offer was a fantasy, Dad. A number I invented. A real-world, independent valuation, which I have right here, put the company's actual worth, including all assets, closer to $20 million. And that's being generous. Apex wasn't going to buy you out. They were going to wait for you to go belly up and then buy your equipment and client list for pennies on the dollar at a bankruptcy auction. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, firm, and final statement that cut through all the noise, all the lies, and all the years of pain. "I didn't buy your company," I said, looking from my father to Mark to Chloe, making sure they each felt the weight of my words. "I overpaid by $30 million to save your legacy, from them and from yourselves." The aftermath of my words was not an explosion, it was the opposite. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the dining room. The silence that followed was a physical thing. A thick, heavy blanket that smothered the half-eaten Thanksgiving feast. My mother, who had been a silent spectator to the whole ordeal, finally let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth. The festive centerpiece of autumn gourds and candles suddenly looked like a funeral arrangement on a tomb. The scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon now mingled with something acrid, like burnt trust. Chloe was the first to break. Her face, which had been glowing with vicious triumph moments before, crumpled like a discarded napkin. "No," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. The tears that streamed down her face weren't tears of familial sorrow. They were tears of pure, unadulterated greed. "What do you mean? The money, The 50 million. Does this mean I don't get my share? I looked at my sister, at her designer dress and the expensive watch on her wrist, and felt nothing but a hollow point of pity. There is no your share, Chloe, I said, my voice devoid of the anger she expected. It was colder, more final. You raised a glass to my disinheritance. You celebrated the idea of me getting nothing, while you got rich off the back of a legacy you never once lifted a finger to build. You didn't value a brother, you valued a payout. The payout is gone. She let out a wail, a theatrical, self-pitying sound that grated on my raw nerves. But that's not fair. He said, Dad promised. Dad didn't know he was promising away money that I was putting on the table, I countered, my gaze unwavering. That's when Mark finally found his voice. He shot up from his chair, knocking it backward with a loud clatter that made my mother jump. His face was a mask of thunderous fury. His complexion flushed a blotchy, furious red. You, he spat, his finger jabbing in my direction. You liar! You snake! Coming back here, playing the big shot, trying to steal Dad's company right from under him. Steal it? I almost laughed, but the sound wouldn't come. Mark, I just told you, I overpaid by $30 million. The only person trying to steal anything here was Apex Development. They were going to leave you all with pennies. He stalked around the table, his fists clenching and unclenched at his sides. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Riding in on your white horse to save us? You set this all up. You planned this whole pathetic drama. He was getting closer, his rage coiling like a spring. He lunged, not to hit me, but to grab the phone off the table, as if destroying the digital proof would somehow undo the reality. My mother screamed his name, a sharp, piercing sound. Mark, stop it! He froze, his hand hovering over my phone, his chest heaving. And in that moment, seeing the cornered, desperate animal in his eyes, everything clicked into place. The years of snide comments, the subtle ways he'd undermined me with our father, the convenient failures that always seemed to push me further away. It was you, I said, the realization landing with the dead weight of a stone. Apex knew which contracts to undercut. They knew exactly where our supplier lines were weakest. They knew Dad was getting desperate. They had inside information. I stared directly at my brother, the man I grew up with, the man who was supposed to have my back. They got it from you. For a second, Mark's face went blank with shock. Then, the rage of being exposed twisted his features into something ugly. It was a confession without words. His desperate gamble to get rich after helping a competitor gut our family's life work had just gone up in smoke, and he was left with nothing but the ashes of his own treachery. You poisoned him against me, I continued, my voice low and dangerous. For years, every idea I had, you told him it was foolish. Every time I tried to help, you told him I was trying to take over. You pushed me out, Mark. You did this. He deserved it, Mark finally roared, the dam of his composure bursting. You always thought you were better than us, better than this business. You waltzed off to Austin to play with your computers and your money, leaving us here to do the dirty work. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who put in the hours. Apex was going to give me a senior position. They were going to give me a real payout, not just Dad's table scraps. I earned it. The sheer, breathtaking selfishness of his confession hung in the air. He hadn't just betrayed the family. He was proud of it. He saw it as his due. My mother was openly weeping now, her face buried in her hands. Chloe was staring at Mark with a mixture of horror and confusion, as if she couldn't comprehend a betrayal that didn't directly involve her own bank account. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, a grief for a brother I realized I had lost long ago, if I ever truly had him at all. Get out of this house, I said. It wasn't a request. This is my house, he snarled. Not anymore, I replied, my voice leaving no room for argument. Get your things and get out. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw a stranger contorted by jealousy and greed. The brother I remembered was gone, replaced by this bitter, hollowed-out man. Now. He stood there for a long moment, his jaw working, searching for another argument, another threat. But there were none left. He was beaten. Without another word, he turned, stormed out of the dining room, and, a minute later, the front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a final judgment. The room fell quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a battlefield after the fighting is over. My mother's quiet sobs were the only sound. I walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder, but I didn't know what to say. How could any words fix this? After a moment, I knew there was one last thing I had to do. I turned and walked toward my father's study. The solid oak door was closed. I knocked softly. There was no answer. I knocked again, a little louder. "Dad?" Still nothing. I took a breath, turned the knob, and was surprised to find it unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, closing it gently behind me. The study was my father's fortress. Paneled in dark cherry wood and lined with bookshelves, it smelled of old paper, leather, and polish. A lifetime of Miller & Sons achievements. Framed photos of groundbreaking ceremonies, civic awards, blueprints of major projects adorned the walls. But the man sitting in the high-backed leather chair behind the massive desk looked nothing like the titan who had built all of this. Richard Miller looked small. He was slumped in his chair, staring out the window at the darkening late afternoon sky, his back to me. His shoulders, usually so broad and imposing, were bowed. He didn't turn when I came in. He just sat there, a statue of a broken man, surrounded by the monuments of a life he now saw differently. The dossier I had put on the dining room table lay on his desk, its pages rifled through. He knew everything. I didn't speak. I just stood there, waiting. The tense silence stretched on, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 arguments, a decade of misunderstanding, and the fresh, gaping wound of tonight's revelations. Finally, without turning around, he spoke. His voice was raspy, hollowed out, a pale imitation of the booming baritone I knew. He told me, "Mark told me your plan to digitize the accounting and project bids was a way to cook the books, to hide money from me." He paused, taking a shaky breath. He said your proposal to invest in modern, energy-efficient building materials was a scam you were in on with a new supplier, a way to get kickbacks. Another pause. He said you going to Austin wasn't for your career. He said you left because you were ashamed of us, ashamed of this family. He finally swiveled his chair around, and for the first time, I saw his face. The anger was gone. The pride was gone. All that was left was a vast, desolate landscape of shame and regret. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he looked 10 years older than he had 3 hours ago. He looked at me, truly looked at me, as if seeing his son for the first time. "You were right." The words were barely a whisper, freighted with the weight of years of stubborn pride. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was a concession, a surrender. It was the quiet, agonizing acknowledgement that he had listened to the snake and cast out the son who had tried to save him. 6 months. It's a strange unit of time, not long enough to forget, but just long enough for a new reality to set in, for the sharp edges of a memory to dull into a lasting ache. The Thanksgiving that shattered our family felt like a lifetime ago. Yet the echo of that silence, the one that fell after I said, "Dad, I am Everest Holdings," still rang in my ears on quiet nights. The first thing I did was change the name. Miller & Sons Construction was a relic, a monument to a tradition that had nearly suffocated itself. It was my father's name and his son's, a definition that had explicitly and then financially excluded me. In its place, I established the Miller Legacy Group. The name was a deliberate choice. It honored the past, the decades of hard work my grandfather and father had poured into the company. But it looked toward the future. A legacy isn't just something you inherit. It's something you build upon, something you carry forward. Walking into our new headquarters felt like stepping into a different century. The dusty wood-paneled office in Columbus, filled with yellowed blueprints and the faint smell of stale coffee, was now a state-of-the-art facility in a glass and steel building downtown. The old wheezing desktop computers were replaced with a network of sleek monitors displaying real-time project analytics. On a massive smartboard in the main conference room, the schematics for our first major undertaking were displayed in brilliant 3D. It was a sustainable housing development on the outskirts of the city. Energy-efficient homes, green spaces, community gardens. It was the kind of forward-thinking project I had pitched to my father years ago, the kind he had dismissed as tree-hugging nonsense. Now, it was our flagship. The new space was filled with a new kind of energy. I'd kept on every single loyal, long-term employee who wanted to stay. The foremen, the engineers, the craftsmen who were the true backbone of the company. Their decades of experience were priceless. But now, they worked alongside bright, ambitious graduates from Ohio State's engineering program. I'd watch as a 60-year-old site manager, a man who could frame a house in his sleep, would patiently show a 22-year-old coder how a structural load actually behaves in the real world. In return, the kid would show him how to use a tablet to file a site report in 30 seconds, saving him an hour of paperwork. This was the synthesis I had always dreamed of, experience fused with innovation. Of course, not everyone was part of this new chapter. Mark was a ghost. After his confession, after the venom and desperation had poured out of him, there was nothing left to say. I didn't yell, I didn't rage, I just told him to pack a bag and be gone by morning. The security of my father and the company's future depended on his complete removal. He had poisoned our family from the inside, a rot that had started long before he began feeding information to Apex Development. The legal team made sure he signed away any and all claims to the family name or assets. I heard through a distant cousin that he'd moved out west somewhere, but his name was never spoken in my presence again. He was a closed chapter, a painful lesson in ambition curdled into treason. Chloe's fate was different. She wasn't a villain. She was just weak, swept up in the promise of easy money and a lifetime of leisure. That Thanksgiving, her tears weren't for the family breaking apart, but for the $25 million she had already spent in her head. So I gave her a lesson in value. I set up a small trust for her, enough to live on comfortably but not lavishly. But there was a condition, ironclad and non-negotiable. The trust would only pay out a monthly allowance as long as she was employed. The last I saw of her, she was folding sweaters at a high-end department store at the Easton Town Center, her perfectly manicured nails a stark contrast to the drudgery of retail. She hated it, I'm sure. But for the first time in her life, she was earning her own way. Maybe, just maybe, she'd one day understand what that meant. My father was the most profound change of all. The rage and humiliation of that night had broken something in him. He had locked himself in his study for 2 days. When he finally emerged, he looked 10 years older. The bluster was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out weariness. He didn't fight me on the changes to the company. He didn't argue when I told him what happened with Mark. He just nodded, his gaze fixed on some distant point over my shoulder. His quiet admission, "You were right," wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. It was the sound of a man confronting the ruins of his own judgment. 6 months later, he was a different person. He had sold the sprawling family home, a place now tainted with too many bad memories, and moved into a smaller, more manageable house closer to the city. One Tuesday afternoon, there was a soft knock on my open office door. I looked up to see him standing there, holding a rolled-up tube of old blueprints. He looked smaller, not defeated, but humbled. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Of course, Dad. Come on in." He walked over to my desk and carefully unrolled the plans. They were for an old commercial project from the 90s. The paper was yellowed and brittle. He pointed a slightly trembling finger at a section of the foundation diagram. "I was looking at the plans for the new Sycamore Creek project," he began, "not as a boss but as a colleague. The soil composition out there, it reminds me of this site. We ran into a drainage issue, had to install a series of French drains this specific way." He traced a line on the old paper. "If you do it like this from the start, before you pour the slab, it could save you a week on the schedule, maybe more if we get a wet spring." I leaned in, studying the old drawing. He was right. It was a brilliant, low-tech solution born from hard-won experience, something no computer simulation would have ever suggested. I looked up from the blueprint and met his eyes. For the first time in as long as I could remember, there was no tension, no resentment, no power struggle. There was only the work. "That's a great idea, Dad," I said, and I meant it. "Can you walk our lead engineer through it?" A small, genuine smile touched his lips. I think I can handle that. A little while later, I stood by the massive, floor-to-ceiling window of my office, and my father joined me. Below us, the Sycamore Creek site was a whirlwind of organized activity. Trucks moved, cranes swung, and the first frames of the new houses were beginning to rise against the Ohio sky. He didn't say anything, just stood beside me, our shoulders almost touching. We were just two men, a father and a son, watching our legacy being built. The family was broken, perhaps irreparably, but looking out at the future taking shape, I felt a quiet sense of peace. The name Miller was no longer about sons who obey, but a legacy that endures. It was a legacy we were building together.